The mysterious new guard. Ethan adjusted his uniform, glancing nervously at the towering gates of the royal palace. The sun gleamed off the polished walls, and alien plants lined the path, their glowing blue petals swaying in the breeze. He had been assigned here just yesterday, but already whispers about the princess reached his ears. Zara, they said, the most beautiful and mischievous creature in the galaxy. Ethan wasn't sure what to believe. He had heard the rumors. No guard lasted more than a week. Some said it was because of her powers. Others hinted that her charm was impossible to resist. Whatever the truth was, Ethan planned to stay professional. He needed this job. His home planet's economy had collapsed, and work for humans was rare. Protecting royalty seemed like an easy way to earn a steady income. As he stepped into the grand hall, his boots echoed on the marble floor. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, adorned with crystal chandeliers that seemed to float. Alien dignitaries passed by, their strange features and colorful attire making Ethan feel out of place. But then he saw her. Princess Zara lounged on a shimmering throne, her silver hair cascading like a waterfall. Her violet eyes sparkled with mischief as she whispered something to her assistant. When her gaze landed on Ethan, she smiled. A slow, playful smile that made his stomach flip. "Ah, the new guard," Zara said, her voice smooth and musical. "Let's see how long you last." Ethan bowed stiffly. "Your Highness, I am here to serve and protect." Zara tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, you're serious, aren't you? How boring." She waved a hand dismissively, but Ethan didn't miss the faint glow around her fingers. He had read the briefing. Zara was a telepath and an empath, capable of reading thoughts and influencing emotions. It was why so many guards quit. They couldn't handle the pressure of her constantly being in their heads. Ethan straightened his back. He had trained for this. "I don't mind boring," Ethan replied calmly. "It's safe." Zara's laughter filled the room, light and carefree. "We'll see about that, human." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Zara seemed to appear wherever he was, casually leaning against a doorway or pretending to read a datapad. Her subtle smirks and knowing glances put him on edge. That evening, as Ethan stood guard outside her chambers, she approached him. "Tell me, Ethan," Zara began, her voice softer now. "What do you think of me?" Ethan didn't look at her directly. "It's not my place to think about you, Your Highness. My job is to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" she asked, stepping closer. "No one would dare harm me here." "Sometimes the danger isn't outside," Ethan said carefully. "It's within." Zara's eyes flashed with interest. "You're different," she murmured. "Most guards are terrified of me by now." Ethan felt a strange pressure in his mind, like someone trying to open a locked door. He clenched his fists, focusing on his training. The pressure faded. Zara raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Not bad," she said, a hint of admiration in her tone. "Most people can't resist me." Ethan met her gaze, his expression steady. "I'm not most people." For a moment, Zara said nothing. Then she smiled, a genuine smile that made her look almost human. "Good. I was getting bored." Just as Ethan thought the conversation was over, Zara's playful demeanor vanished. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful, Ethan. Not everything in this palace is as it seems." Before he could ask what she meant, she was gone, disappearing into her chambers. Ethan stood there, her words replaying in his mind. He had expected a spoiled princess, not someone who hinted at hidden dangers. That night, as Ethan patrolled the halls, he caught a glimpse of something, or someone, moving in the shadows. His hand instinctively went to his weapon, but when he turned the corner, there was nothing there. Ethan shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew better. Something wasn't right. And whatever it was just beginning. Powers that crossed the line. The next day, the palace was buzzing with excitement. The royal gala was fast approaching, and all eyes were on Princess Zara. Ethan stood by the entrance, trying to keep an eye on everything, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Zara had warned him about the palace, but he wasn't sure what to believe. Her playful attitude had been replaced with something more serious. It was as if she was hiding the deeper truth. Ethan had seen her powers before. Small, harmless tricks she performed for the amusement of her guests. She'd read a few minds, influenced a few emotions, and caused some lighthearted pranks that had everyone laughing. But there was always a moment when the smile would fade from her face, a flicker of something darker would appear in her eyes, and Ethan couldn't help but feel that maybe her powers weren't as harmless as they seemed. Today, however, was different. Zara had invited a few important dignitaries from different star systems to the gala. They all seemed eager to meet the mysterious princess, but Ethan noticed how nervous they were around her. As the dignitaries mingled, Zara walked among them, her every movement graceful and precise. Her charm was magnetic, and it was clear that everyone in the room was drawn to her. Yet Ethan couldn't shake the suspicion that there was something lurking beneath her charming exterior. It wasn't until later that evening, when the gala had reached its peak, that the tension began to mount. Zara stood on the balcony, speaking to the crowd below. She was always the center of attention, but tonight something felt different. Ethan watched her closely, his eyes never leaving her. She glanced at him once, a fleeting moment that felt like a challenge. For a split second, he felt the familiar pressure in his mind again, but this time it was stronger. He could hear her thoughts, confused, restless, like she was searching for something. Then, as if on cue, a strange energy filled the air. The crowd quieted, and Zara's voice rose above the silence. "Tonight, we celebrate," she declared, her words carrying an unexpected power. "But I ask you all to remember that not everything is as it seems." Before anyone could respond, a sudden, deafening crash echoed through the hall. A large chandelier above the dance floor shattered, sending a shower of glass down onto the guests. People screamed, scattering in all directions. Ethan's heart raced. He drew his weapon and rushed toward the source of the explosion, but Zara was already there, standing calmly in the midst of the chaos. Her eyes were closed, and her hands were raised, as if she were controlling the very air around her. The guests were frozen, some with looks of fear, others with confusion. Zara's eyes snapped open, and for the first time, Ethan saw something he hadn't noticed before: desperation. Her powers had gone too far. The chandelier had fallen not because of some accident, but because Zara had lost control. She looked at Ethan, her expression pleading. "Help me," she whispered. "I can't stop it." Ethan rushed to her side, but before he could reach her, the lights flickered and then went out completely. The palace was plunged into darkness. "Stay calm," he shouted, trying to reassure the guests and the princess. His voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no answer. The room was silent, save for the distant sound of panicked footsteps. Zara's breathing was heavy, uneven. "I didn't mean to." But before she could finish, a voice rang out from the shadows. It was a voice Ethan had heard only in passing, one that carried an air of authority and menace. "You should have stayed out of this, Zara," the voice said coldly. A figure stepped out from the darkness, moving toward them with deliberate steps. It was one of Zara's personal advisors, an older man named Tryon. Ethan had seen him in the palace before, but he hadn't thought much of him. "You think you can control the palace with your powers?" Tryon sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. "You are nothing but a tool for the real rulers here." Ethan instinctively stepped between Zara and the approaching figure. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Tryon smirked. "Zara has always been a liability. She's too dangerous. And now she's going to destroy everything we've worked for." Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had no idea what Tryon was talking about, but one thing was clear: Zara was in danger, and so was everyone in the palace. Zara's hands trembled at her sides, and Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. She was struggling to keep her powers in check, But the strain was too much. Her mind was being overwhelmed by the pressure. It was as if she couldn't stop herself from unleashing her abilities. "I didn't want this," Zara whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to be free." But now, her words were cut off by a loud bang. A force of energy erupted from her, sending Tryon flying backward. The walls trembled, and Ethan barely managed to keep his footing. "Zara," Ethan shouted, rushing to her side. "You have to stop." But it was too late. Zara had lost control completely. The force of her telekinetic power was growing stronger with every passing second. Ethan tried to reach her, to help her regain control, but the energy surrounding her was too powerful. He could feel it pushing him back, as if the very air around them was alive. Suddenly, everything went black. Hidden enemies. Ethan woke up in a dark, cold room. His head ached, and his body felt heavy, as if he'd been dragged through a storm. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his vision blurry. The last thing he remembered was Zora losing control of her powers. The explosion of energy had knocked him unconscious, but now, he was alone. He scanned the room, his heart pounding. It was a small, isolated chamber, with no windows and only one door, which was slightly ajar. He stood up, trying to steady himself, and moved cautiously toward the door. His training kicked in. Never let your guard down, always be alert. As he stepped into the hallway, a strange, unnatural quiet surrounded him. The usual sounds of the palace were absent. No servants rushing to and fro, no soft chatter in the halls. It felt like the entire place had fallen into a deep sleep, or worse, a trap. Ethan's instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. The power outage, the energy surge, Zora's desperate look, it was all part of something much bigger. Whoever had orchestrated this had been waiting for the right moment to strike. He took a deep breath and moved stealthily through the dimly lit corridor. He didn't know where he was, or even how he had gotten there, but he had a singular goal: find Zora and figure out what was going on. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the princess than he had been told, something dark, something dangerous. As he moved past a set of heavy doors, he overheard voices. He paused, pressing his back against the cold stone wall, straining to hear. "The princess is becoming a problem," one voice murmured. It was a low, gravelly tone. Definitely not Zora's. Ethan recognized the voice. It was Tryon, the advisor who had confronted Zora at the gala. "We can't let her lose control again," another voice replied, this one more nervous. "She's a ticking time bomb. If we don't act quickly, we could lose everything." Ethan's mind raced. What were they talking about? Zara was the one in danger, not the other way around. He knew she wasn't the real threat here. She had been manipulated. Someone had been controlling the palace behind the scenes. But who? Ethan carefully edged closer to the door, keeping his breathing steady. He couldn't risk being seen. The voices grew louder, and he caught a few more words that sent a chill down his spine. "We need to put a stop to her before she finds out too much," Tryon said coldly. "She's the key to everything, but she's dangerous now. If we can't control her, we'll have to eliminate her." The second voice hesitated. "But what about the guards? The king won't." "The king doesn't know," Tryon interrupted sharply. "No one knows. Not yet. But soon, when it's too late for anyone to stop us, we'll have everything under our control. The princess won't be able to stop us. The palace won't even know what hit it." Ethan's blood ran cold. Eliminate her. That was the last thing he expected to hear. Zora had been the target all along. The palace's dark side was finally showing itself, and Ethan had been blind to it all. He had thought he was here to protect the princess, but the real enemy was the palace itself. As the conversation ended, Ethan's thoughts raced. He needed to find Zora, and fast. But how? If the people inside the palace had been plotting this for so long, how could he even begin to trust anyone? He knew he couldn't take any chances. Tryon had made it clear. Zora's life was at risk. He had to find her before they did. But the palace was a maze, and Ethan was still disoriented from the blast of energy. He had to think. He needed help, and there was only one person who could offer it: Zara herself. Ethan's mind turned back to the time he had spent with her, the way her powers had felt when she used them. Despite the way she had tried to control him with her mind, there was something about Zara. Beneath her playful exterior, Ethan could sense that she wasn't entirely evil. She was just as much a victim as he was, trapped in a world she couldn't control. He had to reach her, and soon. Ethan moved quickly, heading toward the inner chambers where he knew the princess might be hiding. His footsteps echoed in the hall, and the silence was suffocating. The palace felt like a living, breathing thing, watching him with every step he took. As he turned a corner, he came face to face with a group of guards, his fellow soldiers. But something was off. They were standing in formation, not moving, their eyes blank and empty. It was as though they were under some kind of trance. Ethan froze. He had never seen them like this before. These were supposed to be the elite guards of the palace, trained to withstand any threat. But now, they were completely still, as if they were no longer human. A soft voice spoke behind him, sending a chill down his spine. "They're under my control." Ethan turned around slowly. Standing in the doorway was a figure he had never expected to see: Zara, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes glowing faintly with an eerie light. She looked both powerful and lost, like a puppet trying to break free of its strings. "Zara," Ethan whispered, his heart aching at the sight of her. "What happened?" She gave him a sad smile. "It's not my fault. I never wanted this, but I've been kept in the dark, Ethan. They've been using me." Ethan's heart sank. Who's controlling you?" Zara looked over her shoulder, her eyes filled with dread. "Tryon. He's the one behind it all. He's been using my powers to manipulate everything, from the palace to the king. They're going to destroy it all unless we stop them." Ethan stepped forward, determined. "Then we'll stop them together." But before Zara could respond, the air around them crackled with energy. Ethan turned, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. Tryon stepped out of the shadows, his cold eyes locking onto Zara. "You really thought you could escape?" he sneered. "You're nothing but a tool, Zara. A means to an end." Ethan's pulse quickened. He wasn't going to let Tryon get away with this. Not again. The scandal breaks. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Ethan stood beside Zara, his hand tightly gripping the hilt of his weapon as Tryon advanced toward them with an almost predatory grace. His expression was cold, detached, as if he had already won. Zara, however, was no longer the confident princess who had flirted with Ethan on their first meeting. The weight of the situation, the knowledge of her manipulation, had drained the sparkle from her eyes. She looked exhausted, as if the battle for control of her powers had taken everything from her. "You can't stop this, Ethan," Tryon taunted, his voice low and condescending. "You're just a soldier. You're nothing compared to the power of the palace. You've seen what Zara can do. Imagine what I could accomplish if I had control over her abilities. The entire galaxy would bow to me." Zara's breath hitched at his words. It was clear that Tryon had been grooming her for this very moment, using her powers as a means to seize control. But Zara had always been more than just a tool. She was a person who was beginning to realize the depth of the betrayal around her. "You've lied to me, Tryon," Zara said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear and anger in her eyes. "I trusted you. I thought you cared about me." Tryon chuckled, the sound hollow and mocking. "Cared about you? Don't be naive, princess. I never cared about you. You were always just a means to an end. The moment you lost control, you became a liability. And now, I'm going to finish what I started." Ethan could see the flicker of fear in Zara's eyes. But it wasn't just fear. It was a realization. She had been trapped in a game far bigger than herself. And now, her only choice was to fight for her freedom. But the problem was, she didn't know how. Her powers had always been her greatest asset, but now they were something to fear. They were out of control, and the damage they could cause was unpredictable. "Zara, listen to me," Ethan said urgently, stepping closer to her. "You don't have to do this. You're not alone. We can stop him together. You're stronger than you think." Zora's eyes flickered with doubt. She wanted to believe him, but the overwhelming sense of powerlessness gnawed at her. She had seen what she was capable of, and each time she used her powers, she felt a little more like a stranger in her own body. It wasn't just her abilities she feared. It was the darkness that seemed to creep in with every use, the nagging feeling that she was losing herself. But Ethan was right. She wasn't alone. And for the first time in days, she felt the faintest spark of hope flicker in her chest. Before she could say anything, Tryon raised his hand, and with a sharp gesture, the air around them pulsed with energy. Ethan barely had time to react before the palace walls trembled, and a loud, crashing sound filled the air. The entire room shook, as if the building itself was reacting to Tryon's will. Ethan tried to hold his ground, but he could feel the force pushing against him. It was as if Tryon's power was flowing through the very walls, making it difficult to move or breathe. Zara's eyes widened in shock as she realized the extent of his abilities. This wasn't just manipulation, it was control. The walls, the floors, everything in the palace seemed to bend to his will. "You see," Tryon sneered, his voice cutting through the chaos, "this is what I can do when I'm in charge. You think you're the one with power, Zara. I can reshape this entire place in an instant. The king's throne, the palace guards, the entire royal family. They'll all be mine, and you'll be my puppet, just like everyone else." Zara's hands trembled, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. She could feel the power surging in her veins, an instinctual urge to fight back. But it wasn't just a fight for control, it was a fight for her very identity. "You're wrong," Zara said, her voice gaining strength. "I am not a puppet, and I won't let you destroy everything I've ever known." With a sudden burst of energy, Zara slammed her palms against the ground. The force of her power shattered the air around her, sending a shockwave through the palace. The walls cracked and the floor buckled, but she held firm. It was as though her very essence was fighting back against the weight of the palace's oppression. Ethan stepped forward, barely able to keep his balance, as the ground trembled beneath him. He looked at Zara, his expression filled with urgency and understanding. "Zara, focus. You can control this. You're not alone." For a moment, it seemed as though she was on the brink of losing herself again, the overwhelming force of her powers threatening to take over. But Ethan's voice broke through the chaos. She wasn't just fighting for control over her powers anymore. She was fighting for her own freedom. With a deep, steadying breath, Zara closed her eyes and centered herself. She focused on the connection between her mind and her abilities, pushing aside the fear and the confusion. Her powers were part of her, not something to be feared, but something to embrace. Tryon's smug smile faltered as he realized what was happening. He tried to push forward, to regain control, but the more Zara focused, the more the walls seemed to resist him. It was as if the palace itself was beginning to reject his influence. "You can't fight me, Zara," Tryon hissed, his eyes narrowing in fury. "You're weak. You always were." Zara's eyes snapped open, and for the first time, Ethan saw her power not as a threat, but as a force of nature. It was overwhelming, but it was hers. And now, she was in control. "I am not weak," she said, her voice cold and determined. "You are." In one final, concentrated burst, Zara released the energy she had been holding back. The force was like a tidal wave, pushing Tryon back with such force that he crashed into the wall. The lights flickered as the shockwave reverberated through the palace, but Zara stood firm. She was done being controlled. Ethan rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. "You did it," he breathed. Zara's shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. "No, We did it. But even as they stood victorious, they both knew the fight wasn't over. Tryon may have been defeated for now, but there were others in the palace who would stop at nothing to see their plan through. The real battle was just beginning. Betrayal from within. The echo of the explosion still rang in the air as Ithan and Zara stood amidst the debris. The palace, once a symbol of grandeur and power, now felt like a crumbling fortress, vulnerable and cracked. Zara's powers had proven to be both a blessing and a curse, but one thing was clear. She was stronger than she realized. She had fought back, and Tryon was no longer a threat. For now. But there was no time to rest. Zara's eyes, once clouded with confusion and fear, were now clear and resolute, but the calm that had settled over her was deceptive. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. There was more to this palace than she had ever imagined. And worse, she wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. "You did it," Ethan said quietly, stepping closer to Zara. "You stopped him." Zara nodded, her expression hardening. "I didn't stop him. I just delayed him. Tryon isn't the only one pulling the strings here. He was just the beginning." Ethan watched her carefully, sensing the heaviness in her words. "What do you mean?" "Tryon was powerful, but you defeated him. If we can get word to the king." Zara cut him off. "The king doesn't know everything. He's been kept in the dark, just like I was. The palace, it's not just about power. It's about control. And Tryon wasn't working alone." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" "There's someone else," Zara said, her voice growing darker. "Someone much closer than we thought. Someone inside the palace who's been manipulating everything behind the scenes. And I think I know who it is." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. He had heard the rumors, the hushed whispers that had spread like wildfire through the palace, but he had never taken them seriously. The idea of betrayal from within the royal court had always seemed too impossible to believe. But now, with Zora's admission, everything felt like it was falling into place. "I never wanted to believe it," Zora continued, her gaze distant. "But it's him. It's my father. The king." Ethan felt a wave of disbelief crash over him. The king. The ruler of the entire galaxy. The man who had been the foundation of the palace's power. The symbol of authority and wisdom. It didn't make sense. "You're saying your father is involved in this?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with confusion. Zora nodded slowly, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "He's been using my powers, Ethan. From the moment I was born, he saw me as nothing more than a tool, a weapon to solidify his rule. But he never told me the truth. He's been working with Tryon and others to manipulate everything, to keep the palace under his control. He doesn't care about me, not really. He cares about power." Ethan's mind raced. If Zora's father was behind all of this, then nothing was what it seemed. The king's supposed wisdom, his leadership, it was all a facade. He had been using his own daughter as a pawn, and now that she was no longer under his control, she had become a threat to him. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked, struggling to process the enormity of what Zora was saying. Zora met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I've seen the way he looks at me when I use my powers. He's afraid of me, and he's afraid of what I could become if I truly learned to control them. That's why he kept me in the dark. He didn't want me to realize the truth. He didn't want me to become strong enough to challenge him." Ethan could see the pain in her eyes. The king had been more than just a distant figure to her. He had been her father. The man who should have loved and protected her had been using her all along. And now she was forced to confront the terrifying reality that her family was just as corrupted as the palace itself. But why would he go this far? Ethan asked, struggling to understand. Why not just tell you the truth? Why use Tryon to control everything? Zora's voice faltered slightly. Because he's afraid of me. Afraid of what I could do if I break free from his control. If I learn to control my powers, if I embrace what I'm truly capable of, then I could take everything from him. I could destroy everything he's built, and he knows it. Ethan took a step closer, his expression softening. You won't destroy anything, Zara. You're not like him. You've already proven you can control your powers. You just need to trust yourself. Zara looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. But if I can't trust my father, who can I trust? I thought I could trust Tryon, but he betrayed me. And now, I don't know who else is involved. Ethan's heart sank. He had known from the moment he met Zara that she was different from the others. There was something pure about her, something that set her apart from the power-hungry people who ran the palace. But now, the world she had known, her entire life, was being torn apart. The lines between friend and foe were blurred, and every step forward felt like a step deeper into a web of lies and manipulation. We'll figure it out, Ethan said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Together. Zara looked at him, her expression uncertain. I don't even know where to start, Ethan. If the king is really behind this, then the entire palace is a lie. And I can't do this alone. I need your help. Ethan's eyes met hers, filled with determination. You're not alone. We'll take this one step at a time. We'll expose the truth, no matter who it's against. Just as he finished speaking, the doors to the chamber slammed open. A guard entered, his face pale and panicked. Princess, there's been an emergency. The king, he's calling for you. He demands to see you immediately. Zara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The king had always been an imposing figure, but now, with the truth weighing heavily on her shoulders, facing him seemed impossible. Still, she couldn't back down. Not now. I'll go, Zara said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. But we do this on my terms. Ethan nodded, his grip tightening around his weapon. We'll be ready. As they walked toward the king's chambers, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation would change everything. The truth was out there. And no matter what happened, she had to face it. But what would she find when she looked into her father's eyes? Would he finally show her the love she had always craved? Or would she see the cold, calculating man who had been pulling her strings all along? The rescue mission. The corridors of the palace felt suffocating as Zara and Ethan walked toward the king's chambers. The walls, once grand and impressive, now seemed to close in around them, each step a reminder of the betrayal and secrets that had festered within this place for so long. Zara's mind was a storm of emotions, fear, anger, confusion, and above all, a desperate need for answers. Her father, the man who had raised her, who had been her protector and guide, had turned out to be nothing more than a puppet master, manipulating her from the shadows. The realization hit her hard. The king had never seen her as a daughter. She had always been a tool to secure his rule. But now she was ready to confront him, ready to take back control of her life. She wasn't going to be anyone's puppet anymore. Not her father's, not Tryon's, not anyone's. Ethan walked beside her, his presence a steadying force. Though he was an outsider, a soldier, he had become Zara's ally, her only real ally in this palace full of deception. She could see the unwavering loyalty in his eyes, and it gave her strength. She wasn't alone anymore. As they reached the doors to the king's chambers, 2 guards stepped forward, blocking their path. They were the king's elite soldiers, the ones who were loyal to him above all else. Zara could feel the weight of their scrutiny, their eyes lingering on her, as if they could sense that something had changed. The king demands your presence, your highness, one of the guards said in a voice that held no warmth. You will come with us. Zara's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't the frightened princess she once was. She was stronger now, stronger than any guard in this palace. I'm not going anywhere until I speak with my father, Zara said, her voice cold and firm. I'm not some pawn to be moved at his will. The guard's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. He exchanged a glance with his partner, as if silently debating whether to challenge her. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing for Zara and Ethan to follow. As they entered the king's chambers, The atmosphere shifted. The once grand room, adorned with priceless artifacts and rich tapestries, now felt cold and impersonal. The king sat at his throne, his regal form shrouded in shadow. His eyes glinted with a sharpness that made Zora's stomach churn. He was a man who had mastered the art of manipulation, a man who had used his power to control everything and everyone around him. "Zara," the king said in his deep, authoritative voice, "it's good to see you, my daughter. I trust you've been keeping yourself busy." Zara stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she faced him. "Don't speak to me like that, father. You don't get to pretend that everything is normal. I know what you've been doing. I know about Tryon. I know about the lies." The king's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that resembled anger, but also fear. For the first time in her life, Zara saw a crack in the facade that her father had so carefully built. "You're mistaken," the king said, his voice smooth and controlled. "You've been misled. Tryon has been. Untrustworthy, yes, but he never had my blessing to act on his own. He was trying to use you, Zara, to advance his own goals. I never wanted you involved in that." Zara stepped forward, her fists clenched. "You're lying, father. You used me from the beginning. You wanted my powers, my ability to control minds, to control people. You didn't care about me. You only cared about your power." The king's eyes darkened, and for the briefest moment, his calm composure slipped. "You don't understand, Zara. You never understood the sacrifices I made. The power I sought, it wasn't for me. It was for the kingdom. For our future. The galaxy needs order, and I was willing to do whatever it took to maintain it." "Order?" Zara's voice cracked with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You don't create order by controlling people. You create fear. You've turned this entire palace into a prison, and I've been living in it my whole life. You've been using me, just like you used Tryon, just like you used everyone else in this palace. You never cared about me. You only cared about your throne." Ethan stood silently behind Zora, his hand resting lightly on the weapon at his side. He could see the tension in the room, the way the king was slowly losing his composure. It was clear that Zora had struck a nerve, but what worried Ethan was how far the king was willing to go to maintain his control. "I did what I had to do to protect us," the king continued, his tone more forceful now. "You don't know what it's like to carry the weight of this entire galaxy on your shoulders. You don't know what it means to rule with a heavy hand. You think you can just walk away from all of this, from your duties, from your responsibilities. I made you who you are, Zora. And now you want to throw it all away." Zora's heart pounded as the realization settled over her. Her father didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a tool, a means to an end. She was nothing more than an asset in his eyes, and no matter how much she tried to fight for her freedom, he would always try to pull her back into his web. "I'm done being your pawn," Zora said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "And I'm not going to let you control me anymore. If you want to fight me, you'll have to fight me on my terms. But know this, I will not back down." The king's expression twisted into something dark, something dangerous. "You're a fool, Zora. You think you can stand against me. I spent my entire life building this empire. You are nothing without me. Remember that." Just as the tension in the room reached its peak, a loud crash echoed through the palace, shaking the walls. The ground trembled, and the lights flickered. The king's eyes widened in alarm. "What's happening?" he demanded, standing from his throne. His previous calmness was gone, replaced by a hint of panic. Zara and Ethan exchanged a look. Something was wrong. Something had triggered the palace's defenses, but what? Before they could react, a group of soldiers stormed into the room, their weapons drawn. These weren't the usual palace guards. These were a special unit, highly trained and clearly under someone else's command. Ethan's instincts kicked in, and he immediately stepped in front of Zara, his hand reaching for his weapon. "Stay behind me," he said firmly, his eyes scanning the room. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, surrounding Zara and Ethan, cutting off any escape. The king's face twisted into a scowl. "I knew it," he spat. "You've been plotting against me. This is treason." But Zara wasn't afraid anymore. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was becoming clearer with each passing moment. The king had been preparing for this, preparing for a time when he would need to protect himself from her. Now it was time for her to fight back. Redemption and trust. The cold steel of the palace floor beneath Zora's feet felt foreign now. It was once a place of security, of familial pride. Now it was a battlefield, the walls echoing with lies and the weight of broken trust. Her father, the king, stood at the head of it all. But for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid. Her powers had once been the thing that bound her to his will, but now they were her greatest weapon in breaking free. As the soldiers advanced, their weapons pointed directly at her and Ethan. Zara felt a sudden surge of power, the power she had spent so long trying to control. The energy pulsed within her like a living thing, begging to be released. But this time, she wasn't going to let it consume her. She wasn't going to be controlled by fear or by her father's manipulations anymore. "Stay behind me," Ethan whispered again, his voice a steady reassurance. "We're getting out of here." Zara nodded, though her eyes were locked on the king. The air around them crackled with tension, and she could feel the pull of her own energy, an urge to lash out. But she held it back. This wasn't a fight to be won with destruction. It was a battle for truth. She needed to take control, not just of her powers, but of her destiny. The guards, seeing the truth in her eyes, slowly lowered their weapons. The palace, once a symbol of oppression, now stood on the precipice of something new. The truth had come to light, and with it, hope for the future. Zara turned to Ethan, her expression resolute. "We're not done. There's much to fix. But together, we can make sure this never happens again." And as the last remnants of her father's empire crumbled, Zara and Ethan stood side by side, ready to face the future together.